I'll fix it. An 8-year-old boy, sneakers held together with duct tape, grease buried so deep under his fingernails it had become part of his skin, looked 5 grown mechanics in the eye and said it like he was swearing an oath. They laughed, every single one of them. A 40-year-old Hells Angels bike sat dead in the middle of that garage, rust eating through the tank, engine seized solid, every system rotted beyond recognition. 5 professionals had signed its death certificate, told the club to scrap it, sell it for parts, let it die. But this boy, this poor, fatherless, 8-year-old boy, refused. They gave him 5 days. What happened on day 5, nobody in that garage will ever forget. Before we go any further, subscribe to this channel, hit that bell, and follow this story all the way to the end. Drop a comment telling us what city you're watching from. We want to see how far this story travels. Now, let's begin. The flatbed truck didn't pull into Earl's garage. It crawled in, diesel engine growling low, brakes squealing like something wounded, kicking up dust that hung in the morning air and refused to settle. Earl Dawson heard it before he saw it. He was elbow deep in a transmission job, hands black with grease, back screaming the way it always screamed when he bent too long. 64 years old, 40 of those years spent inside this garage. His knuckles looked like they'd been fed through a meat grinder twice and put back on wrong. His brown hair had gone mostly gray, but his eyes were still sharp, still hungry, still looking for the next machine that needed saving. He straightened up when the truck stopped, wiped his hands on a rag that hadn't been cleaned since last Tuesday, stepped toward the bay door. 3 men climbed out. Earl's hands stopped moving. Hells Angels. He knew it before he saw the patches, knew it from the way they moved, unhurried, deliberate, like men who'd stopped caring what the world thought of them a long time ago. Leather cuts worn soft from decades of highway wind, boots that had walked through things most people only read about. The tallest one had a gray beard that touched his chest and a scar that split his right cheek from ear to jawline. Earl would learn his name was Roach. The other 2 flanked him, younger, harder, saying nothing. None of them said hello. None of them shook hands. They walked to the bed of the truck and stood there, staring at the shape underneath the tarp. Earl walked over, slow. Something in his chest had gone tight, and he didn't know why yet. Roach gripped the edge of the canvas. The other 2 did the same. They pulled it back in one motion, no ceremony, no hesitation, and the morning light hit what was underneath. Earl stopped breathing. The bike was a corpse. That was the only word for it. A 1983 Harley Shovelhead, custom built, in 40 years of silence, had turned it into something that barely looked like a motorcycle anymore. The chrome had oxidized to a dull, pitted gray, like old bone left in the sun. Paint peeled away in strips, revealing rust underneath. Not surface rust, deep, aggressive rust that had eaten through whole sections of the tank like cancer through tissue. The tires were flat, rotted through. The exhaust pipes were caked in grime, so thick it looked like someone had poured concrete over them. The seat leather was cracked and split, shaped by a body that hadn't sat in it for 4 decades. Earl circled it, once, twice, 3 times. His boots scraped the floor. His jaw worked, chewing on words he couldn't say. His eyes traced every line, every curve, every scar in the metal. When he finally spoke, his voice came out barely above a whisper. "I know this machine." Roach stepped forward, looked Earl straight in the eye. His voice sounded like gravel dragged over broken glass. "Then you know what we're asking." Earl's hand came up, rubbed the back of his neck. His eyes stayed locked on the bike. "Yeah," he said, "I know what you're asking." He turned to face them. "And I know it's impossible." Roach didn't blink. "We didn't come here for impossible. We came here because a dying man asked us to." Earl's jaw tightened. He stared at the bike for a long time. Then he pulled out his phone and started making calls. Within 24 hours, Earl had assembled the best mechanics in the state, called in every favor he'd been saving for 40 years, told each one the same thing: bring your tools, bring your eyes, and don't make any promises. Wade Prescott showed up first, drove 3 hours from Jackson, senior Harley specialist, 22 years rebuilding police bikes, the kind of machines that got beaten half to death on city streets and dragged back from the edge. Wade worked by the book. Every bolt had a spec. Every wire had a diagram. Every problem had a solution you could find in a manual. He didn't believe in gut feelings. He believed in process. He walked into the garage, saw the bike, and stopped dead. "Earl," he said, "that's not a motorcycle. That's an archaeological dig." "I know what it is." "Then you know what I'm going to tell you. I'm asking you to look before you tell me anything." Wade set his jaw, dropped his bag, got to work. Diane Hartley came next, engine specialist with a reputation that stretched 3 counties and a tongue sharp enough to cut steel. No patience for excuses. No tolerance for false hope. She'd been cracking open engines since she was 15. 30 years of seizures, meltdowns, catastrophic breaks that sent metal through metal. If Diane said a machine was dead, you didn't argue. You just started writing the obituary. She took one look at the bike and turned to Earl. "You're kidding." "I'm not." "Earl, I can see the rust from here. I can see it eating through the tank." "Then get closer and tell me what else you see." She gave him a look that would have melted chrome. Then she crouched beside the bike, pulled a flashlight from her pocket, and started working. For 3 days, they tore that machine apart. Wade started with the fuel system, pulled the tank, traced the lines, disconnected the carburetor. What he found made him go pale. "Earl," he called out, holding up the fuel line like evidence at a murder trial. "This isn't clogged, it's fossilized. Whatever fuel was in here 40 years ago turned to concrete. Solid. You could use this thing as a hammer." He set it down on the bench. "This isn't a bike anymore. It's a coffin on wheels." Diane worked the engine, pulled the plugs first, standard procedure. They came out in her hands like artifacts from a tomb, corroded beyond recognition, electrodes eaten away, ceramic cracked and crumbling. She moved to the wiring, traced connections with her fingers. The insulation disintegrated at her touch, just fell apart, brittle and dead, exposing copper that had turned green. She stood up, wiped her hands on her jeans, looked at Earl with the kind of expression doctors use when the news is bad. "Even if we replaced everything," she said, "and I mean everything, every wire, every gasket, every seal, the frame's compromised, hairline fractures, she'd shake apart at 60 miles an hour and kill whoever's on her." Earl stood back, arms crossed. He didn't argue, didn't defend the bike. He already knew what they were finding because he'd spent the first night alone with it, running his hands over the frame, checking welds, feeling for cracks. He'd found them. Time and stillness had done what the road never could, weakened it from the inside out. Wade pulled the battery, dead, swollen, acid leaked through the housing, pulled the brake lines, cracked, dry-rotted, useless, pulled the clutch cable, frayed to the point where a hard look might snap it. Every system he touched told the same story. By the end of day 3, the garage looked like a morgue. Parts spread across the floor, tagged and cataloged. Wade had filled 2 pages of notes. Diane had taken photographs of every failure point, every crack, every piece of evidence that said this machine was finished. They gathered around the workbench. The silence between them said everything before anyone opened their mouth. Wade spoke first. "I've rebuilt bikes that spent 6 months underwater. I've rebuilt bikes that went through fire. But this," he shook his head, "this is beyond anything I've seen. The fuel system's gone. The electrical's gone. The frame's compromised. We'd need to replace 90% of this machine just to make it safe. And even then, I wouldn't ride it. I wouldn't let my worst enemy ride it. Diane nodded. It's not about money or time. It's about physics. Metal fatigues, rubber rots, wiring decays. This bike sat still for 40 years, and sitting kills machines faster than riding ever could. Movement keeps things alive. Stillness lets them die. Earl stared at the bike, said nothing. His jaw was tight enough to crack teeth. Wade put a hand on his shoulder. I know what this bike meant. I know what you're trying to do. But some things can't be brought back, Earl. Some things are just done. The garage went quiet. The hum of the fluorescent lights above. The distant sound of trucks on Highway 61. The weight of a promise that was starting to feel like a headstone. Earl closed his eyes. Somewhere in his memory, he was standing on a desert highway in Texas, 35 years ago, watching a Hell's Angel named Hawk Brewer walk toward him with a toolbox and a grin and absolutely no reason to stop. But that story wasn't ready to be told yet. Earl opened his eyes, looked at the bike, looked at Wade, looked at Diane. I'll call the angels, he said quietly. Tell them we can't do it. Wade nodded. It's the right call. Diane said nothing, just started packing up her tools. And that's when the screen door opened. Nobody heard him come in. That was the first strange thing. The screen door on Earl's garage had a squeal that could wake the dead, rusted hinges that announced every single person who walked through it. But this time, nothing. Just a shift in the light, a shadow in the doorway, and then he was there. Caleb Whitfield, 8 years old, sandy brown hair that hadn't seen a comb in days, freckles scattered across his nose like someone had flicked a paintbrush at him, clothes 2 sizes too big, a flannel shirt with rolled-up sleeves that kept unrolling, jeans cinched with a belt that wrapped almost twice around his waist, sneakers held together with duct tape, and in his right hand, a toolbox. Worn leather, brass clasps, so heavy it pulled his whole body to one side when he walked. That toolbox was older than Earl. Older than the garage, probably, but Caleb carried it like it was part of his arm. He didn't look at Earl, didn't look at Wade or Diane. His eyes went straight to the bike, locked on like a compass finding north, and he walked toward it without a word. Set the toolbox down on the concrete. Then he reached out and put his hand flat on the frame, fingers spread wide, palm pressed against the metal, like he was checking for a heartbeat. Wade straightened up, irritation flashing hard across his face. Hey, we're working here. This isn't a playground. Caleb didn't look at him, didn't even seem to hear him. His hand moved along the frame, slow, his head tilted slightly to one side, like he was listening. Earl stepped forward. Can I help you, son? Caleb's hand stayed on the frame. His fingers traced a weld line, followed it down to the lower section, came back up. His eyes were half closed, not tired, focused, taking in something through his fingertips that his eyes couldn't see. Diane watched him with narrowed eyes. Kid, did you hear the man? What are you doing in here? Caleb spoke without turning around. His voice was quiet, calm, certain in a way that didn't match his size, or his age, or the duct tape on his shoes. You're giving up on her. The words landed like a slap. Wade let out a breath that was half laugh, half disbelief. Giving up? Son, there's nothing to give up on. That bike is... She's not dead. The interruption stopped Wade cold, not because of the words, because of the way the boy said them. No hesitation, no questioning, like he was stating the color of the sky. Diane put her hands on her hips. Sweetheart, I've been working on engines for 30 years. Trust me, that machine is... She's sleeping. Diane's mouth stayed open, but no words came out. Caleb turned around, faced them, all three. His eyes moved from Wade to Diane to Earl, steady and direct, and Earl felt something shift in his chest, something he hadn't felt in years. A recognition, a memory he couldn't quite place. I'll fix it, Caleb said. 3 words, spoken by an 8-year-old boy with grease under his fingernails in a toolbox he could barely carry. 3 words that should have been laughable, should have been brushed aside with a pat on the head and a "thanks for stopping by, son." But Earl didn't laugh, and he didn't move. Wade did. "You'll excuse me? You'll fix it?" He turned to Earl, incredulous. "Earl, come on, tell this kid." "Everyone's looking at what's broken." Caleb's voice cut through Wade's protest like a blade through paper. "I'm looking at what's still there." Wade stopped talking. Caleb crouched beside the bike, pointed. "You found a fuel line clogged solid. I see a fuel line that held pressure for 40 years without rupturing. That means the seals were good. That means whoever built this bike knew what he was doing." He moved his hand. "You found corroded plugs. Okay. But I see an engine block with no cracks, no warping, no catastrophic failure. 40 years and the block is still solid. You know how rare that is?" He stood, turned to face them fully. "You found dead cables and rotten rubber. Sure. Everything around the bike died. But the bike itself, the frame, the welds, the core, she held. She survived." He looked at Earl. "Every part you pulled off tells you what died. The parts still on this bike tell me what survived. And what survived is stronger than any of you think." The garage went dead silent. Wade opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. "Kid, survival isn't the same as function. That engine hasn't fired in 40 years. Pistons fuse, valves freeze. You can't just—" "I'm not saying just anything." Caleb's voice stayed level. No attitude, no defiance. Just truth, spoken the way you'd read a temperature off a thermometer. "I'm saying everyone in this room looked at this bike and saw a list of broken parts. I'm looking at it and seeing a machine that fought to stay whole for 4 decades. And I think she deserves someone who notices that." Diane studied him, really studied him, head tilted, arms crossed, the way she studied engines that surprised her. "You ever done this before?" she asked. "Brought back something this far gone?" "No." The honesty caught her off guard. "But I brought back a tractor engine that sat in a field for 15 years. A generator Mr. Hicks left in his yard for 8 years. A go-kart motor some kids threw in the creek." He paused. "People always make the same mistake. They look at how old something is and assume it means dead. But machines don't die from age. They die from being beaten while they're alive, or ignored while they're waiting. This bike wasn't beaten, she was loved. Then she was put to sleep." He looked at Earl again, and this time something passed between them, something Earl couldn't name but felt in his bones. "I know how to wake things up." The silence stretched. 10 seconds, 20. The fluorescent lights hummed. A truck rumbled past on Highway 61. The weight of everything hung in the balance. Wade was staring at Earl with an expression that said, "Don't do this. Don't fall for this. He's 8 years old. He fixes lawnmowers. This is a 40-year-old Hells Angels shovelhead, and 3 professionals just told you it's impossible." Diane was watching Caleb's hands. Not his face, his hands. The way they rested at his sides, still and steady. No fidgeting, no nervousness. Hands that had done real work. Earl looked at Caleb and saw something that made his throat close up. He didn't see an 8-year-old. He saw a man on a desert highway, 35 years ago, walking toward a stranger's broken bike with nothing but a toolbox and the stubborn belief that he could help. He saw Hawk Brewer. Same fire, same refusal to quit, same absolute unreasonable certainty that broken things deserve a chance. 5 days, Earl said. Wade's head snapped toward him. "Earl, 5 days. You work here. You don't leave until it's done, or you tell me you can't do it." Caleb nodded once. "I only need 3. Wade actually grabbed Earl's arm. "You can't be serious. He's a child. He's 8 years old. If he damages something—" Earl pulled his arm free, looked at Wade with steady eyes. "If he damages anything, he's out." Earl, this is insane. Maybe. Earl reached into his pocket, pulled out the garage keys, tossed them. Caleb caught them without looking, just reached up and closed his hand around them in midair, like he'd been expecting them. Wade threw his hands up. I don't even... Fine, fine. He pointed at Caleb. And when you fail, kid, when you realize this isn't a lawnmower and you're in way over your head, you walk away and let the people who actually know what they're doing handle it. Caleb looked at him, and for the first time something shifted in the boy's face. Not a smile exactly, something quieter, something that came from a place deeper than confidence. I won't fail. Wade stared at him, then shook his head, grabbed his bag, and walked out. The screen door squealed behind him. His truck started, pulled away, gone. Diane stood by the door. She hadn't moved. She was still watching Caleb, who had already turned back to the bike, already crouching beside it, already placing his hand on the frame again. She spoke to Earl without taking her eyes off the boy. You're really letting him do this? Earl didn't answer, just kept watching Caleb, who had pressed his ear against the engine block. Eyes closed, breathing slow, listening to something no one else could hear. Diane waited. When Earl didn't respond, she shook her head and walked to her truck, stopped at the door, turned back. Earl? Yeah, that kid's going to break his heart on this thing. Earl's jaw tightened. Maybe, or maybe this thing's been waiting for him. Diane drove away. The garage went quiet, just Earl and Caleb and the dead machine between them. Earl watched the boy for a long moment, then he walked to his office, stopped in the doorway, looked back one more time. Caleb hadn't moved. Palm flat on the engine, head tilted, listening. Earl thought about Hawk Brewer, thought about a desert highway and a man who didn't have to stop but stopped anyway. Thought about the last words Hawk ever spoke to him, words Earl had carried for 35 years like a stone in his pocket. We keep each other running. Earl closed his office door, left the boy alone with the machine. 5 days, a bike 5 professionals had called impossible. An 8-year-old with nothing but belief in a dead man's toolbox. The clock started Thursday at noon, and somewhere in that silence, in the space between a boy's hand and 40 years of cold metal, something shifted. Something so small no instrument could measure it. But Caleb felt it, and he didn't let go. Caleb didn't touch the toolbox. That was the first thing Earl noticed when he came back to check on the boy an hour later. The brass clasps were still latched, the leather flap still closed. The toolbox sat exactly where Caleb had placed it, 3 feet from the bike, untouched, and Caleb was sitting cross-legged on the concrete floor with both hands on the frame, eyes closed, breathing so slow it looked like he was asleep. Earl stood in the office doorway and watched him. Didn't say a word, didn't interrupt. Something about the way the boy sat, perfectly still, perfectly calm, like the world outside that garage had stopped mattering, kept Earl's mouth shut. He watched for 10 minutes, then he grabbed his jacket and left. Lock up when you're done, he said on his way out. Caleb didn't respond, didn't open his eyes, didn't move. Earl pulled the door shut behind him and stood in the parking lot for a moment, staring at nothing. Then he got in his truck and drove home, made dinner, ate half of it, sat in front of the television without turning it on. Got up, sat back down, got up again. At 9 o'clock, he drove back to the garage. Caleb was still on the floor. Same position, same stillness, but his hands had moved. They were lower now, resting on the bottom section of the frame where the engine met the chassis. His head was tilted to the side, ear almost touching the metal. Caleb, nothing. Son, it's 9 o'clock. Your mother know where you are? She knows. The voice came out soft but steady. Caleb's eyes stayed closed. Earl leaned against the doorframe. What exactly are you doing? Listening. To what? The engine's been dead for 40 years. Dead things don't hold together for 40 years, Mr. Dawson. Forgotten things do. Earl felt something tighten behind his ribs. He opened his mouth, but nothing came out. So he stood there, watching an 8-year-old boy listen to a machine that hadn't spoken in 4 decades. And for reasons he couldn't explain, he believed that the boy was hearing something. "Get some rest," Earl finally said. "You've got 4 days left." 3. "Excuse me?" Caleb opened his eyes, looked at Earl. "I said I'd need 3. Today doesn't count. Today I'm just learning her language." Earl stared at him, shook his head, walked back to his truck. He was halfway home when it hit him. The thing he'd been trying to name all evening. The feeling that had lodged itself in his chest when Caleb first walked into the garage. It wasn't hope. It wasn't curiosity. It was recognition. He'd seen that same stillness once before. 35 years ago, on a highway outside El Paso. A man kneeling beside a broken engine in 112-degree heat, not rushing, not panicking, just listening. Placing his hands on the metal and waiting for it to tell him what was wrong. Hawk Brewer had worked exactly like that. Earl's hands tightened on the steering wheel. He drove the rest of the way home in silence. Caleb stayed in the garage until midnight. He didn't sleep. He moved around the bike in slow circles, touching everything, running his fingers along fuel lines and cable housings and weld seams. His hands stopped on things his eyes hadn't noticed yet. A dent here, a scratch there, a place where the metal felt different under his fingertips. Then he lay down on his back and slid under the bike. That's where he found it, not with his eyes, with his fingers. A fuel line that wasn't original. The texture was wrong, smoother in some places, rougher in others. He traced it from the tank connection to the carburetor inlet, found 2 splices, 3 different types of hose material, mismatched clamps, bends that weren't factory smooth. Someone had replaced this line. Not professionally. This was a roadside repair. Quick, desperate. The kind of fix you make when you're broken down on the shoulder and just need to get moving again. Caleb's heart started pounding. He slid out from under the bike, grabbed his flashlight, followed the fuel line inch by inch, checking every connection, every splice. The modifications weren't 40 years old. The rubber on the second splice was still flexible. Degraded, yes, but not fossilized. 10 years old, maybe. 15 at most, which meant someone had ridden this bike. Not recently, but within the last decade. Someone had kept it alive, had refused to let it die, had patched and repaired and held it together with sheer stubbornness until the patches couldn't hold anymore. Wade and Diane had looked at 40 years of stillness and assumed death. But the fuel line told a different story. This bike had fought to survive, had been given chances and taken them. And if it had held on this long, it wasn't ready to quit. Caleb sat back on his heels. His hand found the frame again. He pressed his palm flat against the cold metal and whispered, "I hear you." The garage was silent, but Caleb was smiling. He knew where to begin. Word traveled fast. By Friday morning, day 2, Earl's garage had turned into something between a county fair and a funeral viewing. Pickup trucks lined both sides of the road for a quarter mile. Motorcycles filled the parking lot and spilled into the grass. People who hadn't set foot in that garage in 10 years showed up with coffee cups and folding chairs, wanting to see the 8-year-old boy who thought he could do what 3 professionals couldn't. Some came because they believed. Most came because they didn't. A mechanic named Porter Hayes drove over from 2 towns away, leaned against the wall with his arms crossed and a toothpick in his teeth, watching Caleb work. $20 says the kid's crying by lunch, he said loud enough for half the garage to hear. A younger man next to him grinned. 20 says the bike catches fire when he tries to start it. I give him till breakfast, someone else said. Look at him, he's 8. My 8-year-old can't tie his shoes without help. Laughter, heads nodding, money passing between hands. Hey, little man, Porter called out. You sure you don't need some help? I think there's a tricycle out back more your speed. More laughter, louder this time. Someone slapped Porter on the back. Earl, You really letting a child mess with that machine? What happens when the angels find out you handed their bike to a second grader? Earl stood near his office door, arms crossed, face unreadable. He said nothing. Caleb didn't look up. Not once. He'd been working since before dawn, pulling the entire fuel system apart with a patience that didn't belong in a boy his age. Every piece laid out on a tarp in precise order. Every connection photographed with a disposable camera before he disconnected it. Every part labeled with strips of masking tape and a marker he gripped in his small fist. "Somebody get this boy a juice box," Porter said. "He's going to need it." Caleb pulled a section of fuel line free, held it up to the light, turned it, studied it, set it down in its exact place on the tarp, reached for the next connection. His hands never shook, his jaw never tightened. He worked like the crowd was 1,000 miles away. Diane showed up at 10. She'd told herself she was coming to pick up a wrench she'd left behind. That was the lie. The truth was she hadn't slept well, and the reason she hadn't slept well was the boy's hands. She couldn't stop thinking about the way they'd moved on that frame, careful, knowing, reading the metal the way she read engines. She'd been working on machines for 30 years, and she'd never seen hands move like that, especially not on someone who still had baby teeth. She stood at the edge of the crowd watching, not Caleb's face, his hands. The way he tested each fuel line section before deciding to clean it or replace it. The way he examined gaskets under the work light, checking for compression marks that would tell him if they'd sealed properly decades ago. The way he never forced anything. Every bolt turned with exactly the right pressure. Every connection made with a care that bordered on surgical. She moved closer to Earl, voice low meant for no one else. "He's not guessing." Earl's eyes stayed on Caleb. "I know. Look at how he's checking those gaskets. That's not something you learn from fixing lawnmowers. That's instinct." "I know." Diane crossed her arms, chewed her lip. "Where'd he come from?" 4 blocks away, lives with his mother." "Who taught him?" "His grandfather, from what I can gather. Man passed when the boy was 6. Diane was quiet for a moment. 6. He lost his teacher at 6, and he's doing this at 8. Earl nodded. "You really think he can pull this off?" Earl turned to look at her. Something moved behind his eyes. A memory, a debt, a hope he didn't dare say out loud. "I think this bike ended up in the right garage." Porter's voice cut through again. $50 says that engine never turns over. $50. Who wants in?" 5 hands went up. Caleb's hands never stopped moving. By afternoon, the fuel system was done. Not replaced, rebuilt. Caleb had scrounged parts from Earl's scrap pile and 2 junk bikes rusting behind the garage. A fuel line section from an '87 Sportster. Connectors from a '90 Softail. A fuel filter from an '83 Shovelhead that he'd spent 40 minutes modifying with a file and a pocket knife, shaving down the housing millimeter by millimeter until it seated perfectly. He pressurized the system with a hand pump, watched every joint, every connection, every seal. Not a single leak. He allowed himself 5 seconds. 5 seconds of closing his eyes and breathing. Then he moved to the electrical system, and that's where everything almost fell apart. The wiring harness wasn't just old, it was destroyed. 40 years of storage, heat, cold, moisture, had turned the insulation into something that crumbled like ash between his fingers. He tried to trace the main power line from the battery housing to the ignition. 3 inches in, the wire disintegrated in his hand. Just fell apart. Copper underneath turned green with oxidation. Caleb stared at the fragments in his palm. Wade walked in at that exact moment, saw the boy sitting on the floor surrounded by wire fragments, dust and copper shavings on his jeans. Broken connectors scattered around him like shrapnel. Wade stood over him, not cruel, but certain. The way a man is certain when he's been right all along and the proof is sitting on the floor. "That's it," Wade said. "Game over, son. Those connector housings haven't been manufactured in decades. You can't buy them, Can't order them. They don't exist anymore. Caleb looked up at him, didn't speak for a moment. Then he reached into his grandfather's toolbox and pulled out a small leather pouch. Unrolled it on the floor. Inside, dozens of salvaged electrical components. Pins, housings, terminals, tiny pieces of copper and brass and plastic collected over years from broken radios, dead televisions, discarded appliances, things people had thrown in dumpsters and left on curbs. Then I'll make them, Caleb said. Wade's face went through 3 expressions in 2 seconds. Disbelief, anger, and something that might have been admiration before he killed it. Make them. Out of junk. Out of what's available. Kid, do you understand what you're saying? Every connection has to match spec. Every pin has to carry the right current. One bad joint and the whole system fails. Or worse, shorts out and catches fire. You want to hand build an electrical harness for a shovel head from television parts? Caleb looked at him steadily. Do you have a better idea? Wade opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again, found nothing to say, turned on his heel and walked out. The screen door screamed behind him. Diane had been standing 5 feet away, listening to every word. She didn't follow Wade. Instead, she pulled a stool over, sat down 3 feet from Caleb, and watched. For 6 hours, the boy worked with tools most mechanics never touched. Soldering iron held in fingers barely long enough to wrap around the grip. Wire strippers. Heat shrink tubing applied with a lighter he handled with the concentration of a surgeon. He built connectors one at a time, matching pin configurations to diagrams he'd drawn in a pocket notebook, creating custom housings by combining pieces from 3, 4, 5 different sources. When he didn't have the right piece, he modified something close. When modification wasn't enough, he fabricated from scratch. Filing, bending, soldering, testing. Every connection checked with a multimeter he'd borrowed from Earl's bench. Resistance, continuity, every path clean and true. Diane watched his hands, couldn't look away. The precision was real. The knowledge was real. This wasn't a child playing pretend. This was someone who understood electricity the way some people understand music. Not from textbooks, but from somewhere deeper. You always work like this? She asked quietly. Like what? Like you're trying to save someone's life. Caleb's hands stopped. He looked up at her. His eyes were old. That was the only way she could describe it later. His eyes were old. Older than 8, older than 18, carrying something heavy that had nothing to do with wiring or machines. I'm trying to honor one, he said. Diane felt her throat close. She nodded once, looked away, didn't ask any more questions. By 8 o'clock, Caleb had rebuilt 70% of the harness. His hands were raw. His fingers had small burns from the soldering iron, angry red marks he hadn't acknowledged or treated. His shoulders slumped from hours bent over the frame. He was 8 years old, and he'd been working for 14 hours straight, and his body was telling him to stop. He didn't stop. He was reaching for the next section of wire when a sound froze him in place. A click. Small, almost nothing. Metal shifting somewhere deep inside the engine block. Not breaking, settling. Like a joint popping. Like a bone finding its socket. Caleb's hands stopped in midair. His breathing stopped. Everything stopped. He pressed his palm flat against the engine. Waited. 5 seconds. 10. The click came again. Faint. Deep. Near the cylinder head. And it had a rhythm. Click, click. Pause. Click, click. Pause. Caleb closed his eyes, pressed his ear to the block, listened with his whole body, and he understood something that no one else in that garage had considered. Not Wade with his 22 years, not Diane with her 30, not Earl with his 40. This bike wasn't resisting. Every mechanic who'd touched it had approached it like a problem, a collection of failures to be corrected, a dead thing to be forced back to life. They'd looked at it and seen death, and death required force. intervention, rebuilding from the ground up. But that's not what this bike needed. It didn't need to be saved. It needed to be remembered, honored, reminded of what it had been, what it had carried, the life that had passed through its metal for years before the silence came. Hawk Brewer hadn't asked the Angels to fix the bike. He'd asked them to let it run one more time, to let it remember what it was built for. And memory doesn't respond to force. Memory responds to care. Caleb opened his eyes. Something had shifted inside him. A certainty that went beyond confidence, beyond knowledge, into something that felt like faith. He wasn't rebuilding a dead machine. He was waking a sleeping one. And sleeping things don't need violence. They need patience, gentleness, respect. The garage was dark now. Just the one work light cutting a cone of white through the shadows. Caleb sat on the cold floor with his hand on the engine and his heart beating steady, and the whole world narrowed down to this: a boy and a machine, and the memory sleeping inside the metal. His grandfather's voice came to him then, not a memory exactly, more like a presence. Words spoken in a barn that smelled like hay and motor oil, by a man with silver hair and hands that knew things his mouth never said. Machines remember, Caleb. Every mile, every hand, every moment. It's all stored in the metal. And memory, if you respect it, can be woken up. Caleb pressed his forehead against the engine block. Caleb finished the electrical harness at 4 in the morning. His fingers were swollen. 3 burns on his left hand had blistered and burst, leaving raw pink skin that stuck to everything he touched. His eyes were so dry they burned when he blinked. He hadn't eaten since the sandwich Earl had left on the workbench 12 hours ago, and he'd only taken 3 bites of that before setting it aside and forgetting it existed. But the harness was done. Every wire soldered, every connection tested, every circuit verified with the multimeter twice, then a 3rd time because twice wasn't enough. He'd built something no manual would recognize and no factory would approve. A hybrid electrical system stitched together from salvaged television components, radio parts, and pieces of a broken CB unit he'd found in Earl's scrap bin. It shouldn't work. By every standard Wade Prescott had spent 22 years learning, it couldn't work. Caleb plugged the multimeter into the main power line one final time. Touched the leads to the ignition circuit. Watched the needle swing. Clean, strong, continuous. He let out a breath he didn't know he'd been holding. His whole body sagged. Just for a second. 1 second of letting the exhaustion touch him before he pushed it back down. Then he stood up and moved to the engine. This was the part that terrified him. Fuel system rebuilt, electrical rewired. But the engine itself, 40 years of seized metal, frozen valves, pistons that hadn't moved since before Caleb's mother was born. That was the mountain he still had to climb, and he was running out of time. He pulled the spark plugs first. The ones Wade had removed were destroyed, corroded beyond any hope of cleaning. Caleb had known that since day one. What he hadn't told anyone was that he'd already found replacements. 2 days ago, while the crowd was busy placing bets and cracking jokes about juice boxes, he'd slipped out the back door during a gap in the laughter and walked to the junkyard behind Earl's garage. Spent 40 minutes crawling through rusted frames and engine carcasses until he found what he needed. A set of plugs from a 1982 shovel head, still in decent shape, buried in a coffee can under an oil pan. They weren't factory spec, wrong thread pitch by 0.5 millimeter, but Caleb had filed the threads by hand, sitting on the junkyard dirt with a metal file and a patience that would have made a watchmaker nervous, until they matched close enough. He'd adjusted the gap with a feeler gauge so thin it bent if you breathed on it wrong. Now he installed them, one by one, careful. His small fingers struggled with the socket wrench. The plugs were recessed deep in the head, and the wrench was built for adult hands. He had to use both hands on the handle, leaning his whole body weight into each turn. But the threads caught, the plugs seated, snug but not over-torqued. He wiped his forehead with the back of his arm. His hand was shaking, not from fear, from exhaustion. His body was 8 years old, and it had been working for nearly 20 hours straight, and it was telling him in every possible way that this was too much, that he needed to stop, that no amount of willpower could override the simple biology of a child's frame pushed past its limit. Caleb ignored it, reached for the oil. Earl found him at 6 in the morning. The old mechanic had barely slept, kept waking up, checking the clock, thinking about the boy alone in his garage. When he pulled up at dawn, the work light was still on. Caleb was sprawled on the concrete floor with parts spread around him like the aftermath of an explosion. And for one horrible second, Earl thought the boy had collapsed. Then Caleb's head lifted. "Morning, Mr. Dawson." Earl's heart restarted. "You sleep at all?" "Some." "That's a no." Caleb sat up, rubbed his eyes, winced when his burned fingers touched his face. "I need oil. Whatever you've got that's closest to 20W50. Earl stared at him. The boy's face was gray with fatigue. Grease streaked across both cheeks. His eyes were bloodshot and ringed with dark circles that didn't belong on any 8-year-old's face. He looked like a boxer after 12 rounds. "Caleb, when's the last time you ate?" "I ate." "When?" "Yesterday, I think." Earl walked to the mini fridge in his office, came back with a bottle of water and a granola bar, held them out. "Eat, drink, then we talk about oil." Caleb took the water, drank half of it in one pull, bit into the granola bar, chewed twice, set it down, and reached for the wrench again. Earl grabbed his wrist, gentle but firm. "Eat the whole thing." Caleb looked at his hand, then up at Earl's face. Something passed between them. Not a challenge, not a confrontation, an understanding. Caleb picked up the granola bar, ate it, every bite. 20W50, he said when he finished. Earl went to get the oil. By 10 o'clock, the garage was packed again. Word had spread overnight. The boy was going for it today. Day 4. He was going to try to start the bike. People poured in from every direction. Trucks, motorcycles, a van from the local news station. Somebody brought a barbecue grill and set it up in the parking lot like this was a tailgate party. The crowd pushed inside, filling every inch of available space. 200 people, maybe more, pressed shoulder to shoulder, craning their necks, jostling for position around the bike. The 3 Hells Angels stood against the far wall. Roach in the center, arms crossed, face carved from stone. The other 2 flanked him, silent, watchful, giving nothing away. They hadn't spoken to anyone, hadn't asked for updates, just showed up each morning and stood in that same spot like sentinels guarding something sacred. Porter Hayes was back. Same wall, same toothpick, same smirk. $50 says the kid cries, he announced. 60 says the engine doesn't even turn over. Who's in? Hands went up. Money moved. Wade stood near the workbench. He'd driven back this morning, told himself it was to retrieve a socket set he'd forgotten. That was the lie. The truth was the same thing that had brought Diane back. The same thing that had filled this garage with 200 strangers. He needed to see how it ended. Diane sat on her usual stool, arms crossed, face unreadable. She hadn't taken her eyes off Caleb since he'd started his final checks an hour ago. Caleb moved around the bike with a focus that silenced everyone who watched him closely. Checking fuel connections, testing electrical circuits one more time, verifying spark plug gap. His hands were methodical despite the trembling in his fingers, despite the burns, despite the exhaustion that made his movements slightly slower than they'd been 2 days ago. He stepped back, looked at the bike, took a breath that filled his whole body. "She's ready," he said, to no one, to everyone. Earl moved closer. "You sure?" Caleb nodded. "Only one way to find out." The crowd pressed in tighter. The murmuring died. 200 people went silent at the same time, as if someone had hit a switch. The only sound was the hum of the fluorescent lights and the faint tick of the clock on the wall, reading 11:58. Caleb climbed onto the bike. He had to stretch to reach the handlebars, his arms extended full length, fingers barely wrapping around the grips. His feet didn't touch the ground. He balanced on the seat, small and absurd, and completely unshakable. And every person in that garage felt the weight of what was about to happen. He looked at the key in the ignition. His hand hovered over it. 5 days of work, 4 nights without real sleep. A fuel system rebuilt from junkyard scraps. An electrical harness stitched together from dead radios. Spark plugs filed by hand in the dirt. Every ounce of belief an 8-year-old boy could carry poured into this single moment. Caleb turned the key. Click. Just a click. A sharp, mechanical sound from deep in the engine. Nothing else. The crowd held its breath. Caleb turned the key again. The engine coughed. A deep, guttural sound, metal grinding against metal, pistons that hadn't moved in 40 years trying to remember how. The bike shuddered under him. The crowd leaned forward. The cough came again. Deeper, rawer. The engine sputtered, caught for half a heartbeat, released, caught again, and then nothing. Just the clicking, rhythmic, hollow, empty. Caleb turned the key a third time. Same result. Cough, sputter, click, silence. Fourth time, weaker. Fifth, weaker still. Sixth, the engine didn't even cough. Just clicked. Over and over. A dead metronome counting down to nothing. Caleb's hands stayed on the key. He tried once more, twice more, 3 more times, each attempt pulling less from the engine than the last, like watching a candle flame shrink in a draft until there was nothing left but smoke. The clicking stopped. Silence. Total silence. 200 people. Not one breath. Caleb's hand dropped from the key, fell to his side like something cut loose. His shoulders curved inward. His chin dropped toward his chest. He sat on that bike, too big for him, too old for him, too dead for anyone, and the fight went out of him all at once, like air leaving a balloon. Porter Hayes broke the silence. Well, that's that. He peeled himself off the wall, pocketed his winnings, and headed for the door. A murmur followed him, low, sympathetic, unsurprised, the sound of 200 people who'd known this would happen and had come to watch anyway. Wade stepped forward, put his hand on Caleb's shoulder. The boy flinched, not from Wade's touch, but from the gentleness of it. You gave it everything, son. Wade's voice was soft, softer than anyone in that garage had ever heard it. No shame in this. You hear me? No shame at all. Caleb didn't respond, didn't lift his head. Earl moved in. Caleb, you got closer than anyone thought possible. That means something. Caleb's jaw tightened. His hands curled into fists on his knees. When he spoke, his voice cracked down the middle like a board splitting. I promised. Earl frowned. Promised who? Caleb turned his head, looked at Earl, and Earl saw the tears, not running yet, but building, pooling, held back by nothing but the thin wall of pride an 8-year-old boy had built around himself to survive a world that had been cruel to him since before he could understand why. Everyone, Caleb said, his voice broke again. Everyone who gets told they're done. Everyone who gets looked at like they're garbage because they're old or broken or nobody wants them anymore. The garage went so quiet Earl could hear his own heartbeat. Every lawnmower I fixed, Caleb said. His voice was a whisper now, barely holding together. Every radio, every engine Mrs. Patterson threw out, every piece of junk people left on the curb because they decided it wasn't worth keeping. His fists were shaking. That was me. I was fixing me. Every time, trying to prove that thrown away doesn't mean worthless, that just because someone gives up on you doesn't mean you should give up on yourself. His voice shattered. The tears came, not gentle, not quiet. They came the way storms come, sudden and total. His small body shook on the seat of that dead bike. and every single person in that garage stood frozen, watching something they hadn't come to see. Not failure, something far more naked than failure. Caleb wiped his face with the back of his hand, smeared grease and tears across his cheek, tried to speak, couldn't, tried again. My dad left when I was 4. The words came out in pieces, broken glass falling from his mouth. Walked out on a Tuesday, didn't say goodbye, didn't say he was sorry. My mom told me, she told me he said I wasn't worth the trouble. Too quiet, too different, just not enough. Earl's chest tightened so hard he couldn't breathe. I thought, Caleb's breath hitched, his shoulders heaved. I thought if I could fix this bike, the one everybody said was impossible, the one every mechanic in the state gave up on, if I could make it run, maybe that would prove it. Maybe that would finally be enough. Maybe I would finally be enough. The words hung in the air, raw, bleeding, impossible to unhear. 200 people stood in that garage, and not one of them moved. Not one of them breathed. Bikers with tattoos covering their arms and scars on their knuckles stood with tears running down their faces. Men who hadn't cried in 20 years wiped their eyes with calloused hands and didn't care who saw. Diane had her hand pressed over her mouth, her shoulders shaking. Wade's hand was still on Caleb's shoulder. His eyes were red. His jaw was working, chewing on something he couldn't swallow. Roach, the scarred Hell's Angel who hadn't spoken a word in 4 days, stepped forward from the wall. One step, then stopped. His hand came up to his chest, pressed flat over his heart, and he stood there, a man made of road miles and violence and loyalty, honoring an 8-year-old boy's pain the only way he knew how. Earl sat down on the concrete floor, right there next to the bike, joints protesting, back screaming, but he sat down and he looked up at Caleb, who was still shaking, still crying, still trying to hold himself together on a machine that had beaten him. Caleb, the boy didn't look at him. Caleb, look at me. Caleb turned his head. His face was a mess, grease and tears and snot, and the raw, unguarded expression of a child who had just emptied himself in front of strangers. Earl spoke slowly, each word placed like a stone in a foundation. Your father was wrong. Caleb shook his head. Doesn't feel like it right now. He was wrong. Earl said it again, harder, firmer, the way you drive a nail into wood that doesn't want to hold. And this bike doesn't determine your worth. It never did. It never will. Caleb's breathing stuttered, his fists unclenched slightly. You know what I see when I look at what you've done here? Earl said. I see someone who worked 4 days straight on something 5 grown men said was impossible. I see someone who rebuilt a fuel system from junkyard scraps and hand-built an electrical harness from broken radios. I see someone who got closer to starting this engine than any professional mechanic in this state could manage. His voice dropped. That's not failure, Caleb, and you are not worthless. You hear me? You are not broken. You are not enough. You are more than enough. You've been more than enough your whole life. The only person who couldn't see it was the one who left. Caleb's face crumpled. The wall he'd built, the one made of fixed lawnmowers and rebuilt generators, and every broken thing he'd brought back to life to prove he deserved to exist. That wall came down, and behind it was just a boy, just an 8-year-old boy who missed his father and didn't understand why he'd been thrown away. He slid off the bike, stood on the concrete floor with his arms at his sides and his chin trembling. And Earl Dawson, 64 years old, bad back, bad knees, hands that hadn't hugged anyone in longer than he could remember, reached out and pulled that boy into his chest and held him. Caleb grabbed fistfuls of Earl's shirt and sobbed into it, shaking, gasping, letting go of something he'd been carrying since he was 4 years old, and a door closed, and a truck pulled away, and the world got very quiet. Earl held him, didn't speak, just held him and let him cry, and kept one hand on the back of the boy's head, the way his own father had done for him a lifetime ago. The garage emptied slowly. People left in silence. No jokes, no bets, no commentary. Just the quiet shuffling of boots on concrete and the soft click of the door. Wade squeezed Caleb's shoulder one more time before walking out. Diane told him he'd done good work, better than good, and that sometimes things just don't go the way you want them to. Roach was the last of the angels to leave. He stopped at the door, looked back at the boy still pressed against Earl's chest. Then he nodded once, slow, deliberate, and walked into the sunlight. Tommy was the last to go. He stood in the doorway, keys in hand. "Get him home," he said to Earl. "Let him sleep. Come back fresh tomorrow. We'll figure out what to tell the club together." Earl nodded. And Earl, he didn't fail. Make sure he knows that. The door closed, the lock clicked, and the garage was empty. Caleb pulled back from Earl's chest, wiped his face with both hands. His eyes were swollen, his breath still hitching, but the storm had passed, and what was left was calmer, emptied out, lighter. "I'm sorry," Caleb whispered. "Don't you dare apologize. I wanted it so bad." "I know. I really thought I could do it." Earl looked at him, looked at the bike, looked back at the boy. "Go home. Get some sleep. We'll deal with this tomorrow." Caleb nodded, but he didn't move. His eyes drifted to the bike, stayed there. Something flickered in them. Not hope, not yet. Something smaller. A question he couldn't let go of. Earl saw it. "Caleb, go home." "Yeah." Caleb picked up his grandfather's toolbox, walked to the door, stopped. His hand rested on the frame. "She tried. Did you hear it? When the engine caught for that second, she tried." Earl swallowed hard. "I heard it. She's not done. I know everybody thinks she is, but she's not." Earl didn't answer. Caleb left. The screen door squealed shut behind him. Earl sat alone in the garage for a long time. Then he turned off the lights and went home. At midnight, Caleb was back. He hadn't slept, hadn't even tried. His mother had run him a bath, made him soup, sat on the edge of his bed and stroked his hair until he closed his eyes. But the second her footsteps faded down the hallway, his eyes opened. The clicking. He couldn't stop hearing it. That rhythmic, mechanical sound from deep inside the engine. Click, click, pause. Click, click, pause. Everyone in the garage had heard it and dismissed it. The sound of failure, the sound of a dead engine refusing to catch. But lying in his bed, replaying it in his mind, Caleb heard something else. A pattern. A regularity that random failure didn't produce. Random failure was chaotic, rough, inconsistent, different each time. This clicking was steady, precise, repeating at exact intervals. That wasn't failure. That was a signal. He got dressed, grabbed his toolbox, walked 4 blocks through the dark to Earl's garage. Used the key Earl had never asked him to return. The garage was pitch black. He turned on a single work light, walked to the bike, put his hand on the engine block. Cold metal, cold silence. He pressed his ear against the block, the way he'd done on day one, the way his grandfather had taught him, not listening for sound, but for story. 10 minutes of nothing, absolute nothing. Caleb's eyes burned, his body ached. The voice in his head, the one that sounded like a door closing and a truck pulling away, told him to quit. Go home. Accept it. Some things really are impossible. Then the click came. Faint. Deep. Near the cylinder head. Click, click, pause. Click, click, pause. Caleb's heart slammed against his ribs. He grabbed a flashlight, grabbed the wrench, moved fast, faster than he'd moved all week. Hands suddenly steady, exhaustion burned away by something that felt like fire in his blood. He pulled the valve cover. 4 bolts, quick turns, cover off, flashlight aimed inside. And there it was. What 5 mechanics had missed. What 22 years of experience and 30 years of expertise had walked right past. A rocker arm, slightly out of alignment, barely visible, shifted maybe a millimeter from where it needed to be. Not seized, not broken, not damaged, just off. Decades of temperature changes in storage, metal expanding in summer heat, contracting in winter cold, over and over, year after year, had shifted it by the width of a human hair. Enough to throw off valve timing, enough to prevent compression, enough to make the engine click instead of catch. 5 professional mechanics had looked for catastrophic failure, cracks, seizures, breaks, the kind of damage that announces itself. But this wasn't catastrophic. This was a whisper, a machine's way of saying, "I'm not broken, I'm just out of tune. I just need someone to put me back where I belong." Caleb pulled his grandfather's valve adjustment wrench from the toolbox. The handle was worn smooth. The metal was warm from years of hands that had held it before his. His grandfather's hands, steady and sure, working in a barn that smelled like hay and oil. His own hands were small. They wrapped around the wrench and didn't quite close. But they were steady now, completely steady. The shaking was gone. The doubt was gone. Everything was gone except this, a boy and a wrench and a millimeter of metal that needed to move. He loosened the rocker arm lock nut, felt the resistance, applied pressure, not too much, not too little. The arm shifted, clicked into place. He tightened the nut, checked clearance with a feeler gauge. Perfect. Next cylinder, same issue, same fix. Then the third, the fourth, each one taking less time than the last, his hands finding the rhythm, his fingers remembering what his grandfather's fingers had taught them. By 2 in the morning, every valve was realigned. He replaced the cover, tightened the bolts in sequence, wiped away excess oil with a rag. He stepped back, looked at the bike. His hands were still. His heart was steady. His eyes were clear for the first time in 5 days. "You weren't refusing to start," he whispered. "You were telling me where to look." The garage was silent. The clock ticked past 2. Caleb Whitfield, 8 years old, son of a man who walked away, grandson of a man who taught him to listen, stood alone in the dark with a sleeping machine that had just told him its last secret. 12 hours until the deadline, and he knew. He knew the way his grandfather had known, the way Hawk Brewer had known on a desert highway 35 years ago when he'd knelt beside a stranger's broken engine and seen what no one else could see. Some things aren't dead. They're just waiting for someone who listens. Caleb closed his eyes, breathed, then opened them and looked at the bike one last time. "Tomorrow," he said. He locked the garage, walked home through the empty streets, crawled into bed, and for the first time in 5 days, he slept. Caleb's eyes opened at 4:30 in the morning. No alarm, no noise from outside. His body just knew. The way a soldier knows when it's time to move. The way a mother knows when her child is awake in the next room. Something deeper than thought, older than reason, pulled him out of sleep and set him upright in bed before his mind caught up with his body. He sat there for a moment, hands flat on the mattress, heart beating steady and slow. The fear was gone. The doubt was gone. What replaced them was something he didn't have a word for, a quietness that started in his chest and spread outward through his whole body until even his thoughts were still. He got dressed in the dark, same jeans, same flannel shirt, sleeves rolled and re-rolled, same duct-taped sneakers. He picked up his grandfather's toolbox, and for the first time in 5 days, it didn't feel heavy. His mother was standing in the kitchen doorway. Caleb stopped. Ruth Whitfield looked like she hadn't slept either. Her eyes were red. Her hands were wrapped around a coffee mug she wasn't drinking from. She'd been standing there waiting for him, and from the look of her, she'd been standing there for hours. "Caleb, I have to go, Mom." "I know," her voice caught. She set the mug down, walked over, crouched in front of him so their eyes were level. Her hands found his face, palms against his cheeks, thumbs brushing away grime he'd missed in last night's bath. "Whatever happens today," she said, "you are the bravest person I have ever known. You hear me? Not the bravest kid, the bravest person." Caleb's chin trembled, just once, then it steadied. "I'm going to do it, Mom." Ruth's eyes filled. She pulled him against her, held him the way she'd held him on that Tuesday 4 years ago, when the front door closed and the truck pulled away and the world split in half. Held him the way she'd held him every night since, when the nightmares came and he woke up asking why. "I know you are," she whispered into his hair. "I've always known." She let him go, wiped her eyes, handed him a granola bar and a juice box. "Eat on the way." Caleb pocketed them, picked up the toolbox, walked to the door. "Caleb," he turned. Ruth's voice was barely a whisper. "He was wrong. Your father, he was so wrong." Caleb looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded and walked out into the dark. The first truck pulled into Earl's parking lot at 5:45, then another, then 3 motorcycles rolling in formation. By 6 o'clock, headlights lined the road in both directions, engines idling, people pouring out of vehicles in the gray pre-dawn light. By 6:30, the count had passed what the garage could hold. People stood in the parking lot, on the sidewalk, along the shoulder of Highway 61. Someone climbed onto the bed of a pickup truck to get a better view through the bay doors. This wasn't the same crowd from yesterday. Yesterday had been local, townspeople, mechanics from neighboring counties, curious retirees with nothing better to do. Today was different. Word had traveled overnight in ways no one could trace. Bikers from 3 states had ridden through the dark to be here. Old-timers who'd heard about Ghost's bike, about Hawk's bike, through the chain of stories that connected every rider who'd ever worn leather and loved the road. They came because this wasn't just a garage and a broken machine anymore. It was a test, a question the world keeps asking and never once answered. Can something everyone gave up on come back? Earl arrived at 6. He expected to find the garage empty, Caleb still home in bed after the emotional wreck of yesterday. What he found was the garage already open, lights on, and Caleb standing beside the bike with his sleeves rolled up, and a look on his face that stopped Earl dead in the parking lot. The boy was calm, not the brittle calm of yesterday, the forced composure of someone holding himself together through willpower. This was different. This was the calm of someone who knew something no one else did. The kind of calm Earl had seen exactly once before in his life, on a Hell's Angel named Hawk Brewer, who'd knelt beside Earl's broken engine in the Texas desert and said 4 words before starting work. "I see the problem." Earl walked in slowly. "How long you been here?" "Since 5. You sleep?" "Enough." Caleb looked at him. "Mr. Dawson, I found it." Earl's feet stopped moving. "Found what?" The reason she wouldn't start. The clicking. It wasn't failure. It was a signal. The valve timing's off. Rocker arms shifted out of alignment. Maybe a millimeter on each cylinder. Decades of temperature changes. Metal expanding, contracting, settling. It wasn't a compression failure. It was a calibration problem. Earl stared at him. "You're telling me the reason 5 mechanics couldn't start this bike was a millimeter?" "Less than a millimeter on some of them." "And you found this how?" I listened. Earl said nothing for 10 seconds. Then he walked to the workbench, put both hands flat on the surface, and dropped his head between his shoulders. His back shook once. It might have been a laugh. It might have been something else. "Did you fix it?" he asked without looking up. "Last night, all 4 cylinders, realigned and torqued. I used Grandpa's valve wrench." Earl lifted his head, turned around, looked at the boy, small, exhausted, grease-stained, standing beside a 40-year-old machine with the certainty of a surgeon who's already seen the X-ray. "Then let's find out if you're right." The crowd pressed into the garage. Bodies filled every gap. People stood on toolboxes, on crates, on the bumpers of trucks backed up to the bay doors. The local news crew pushed through with cameras, the reporter checking her hair and her mic while her cameraman fought for a sightline. Wade arrived at 7. He told himself he wasn't coming, told his wife he was done with it, told himself the boy had failed, and there was nothing left to see. Then he'd gotten in his truck at 6:15 and driven 3 hours without stopping. He pushed through the crowd and found Diane near the workbench. She looked at him. He looked at her. Neither said a word. They both turned to watch Caleb. Roach and the 2 Hells Angels came in last. They didn't push through the crowd parted for them. Roach walked to the far wall. Same spot, same posture, arms crossed, face giving away nothing. But his eyes were different today. Something lived behind them that hadn't been there yesterday. Something that looked, if you caught it at the right angle, like prayer. Caleb ran his final checks. Fuel connections, solid. Electrical, clean. Spark plugs, seated. Valve alignment, he checked it twice. 3 times, hands moving with a precision that made Diane grip Wade's arm without realizing it. Everything was exactly where it needed to be. He recalibrated the valve timing, Diane whispered. Wade frowned. What? The rocker arms. Look at the valve cover. He pulled it last night. He found something in the valve train. Wade's face went pale. We checked the valve train. I checked it myself. Did you check alignment? Sub-millimeter displacement on the rocker arms? Wade opened his mouth, closed it. His hand came up and covered his eyes. Oh, God. What? I checked for seizure, checked for cracks, checked for warping. His hand dropped. He stared at the bike. I didn't check alignment. It never, a millimeter. How would you even? He listened. Diane's voice was quiet. He put his ear on the block and he listened. Wade looked like someone had punched him in the stomach. The clock on the wall read 11:30, 30 minutes to the deadline. The crowd had gone silent. 250 people packed into and around a garage on Highway 61, not one of them breathing loud enough to hear. Caleb wiped his hands on a rag, folded it, set it down on the workbench with a care that made it feel like a ritual. Then he turned and faced the bike. And that's when the black Cadillac Escalade pulled up. The engine cut. The door opened. Blake Morrison stepped out. Designer jacket, Italian shoes, sunglasses that cost more than Ruth Whitfield made in a month. He walked into the garage the way he walked into everything, like he already owned it and was just deciding what to do with it. His eyes found Earl. I hear the bike's still here. Earl's jaw hardened. You heard right. I also hear yesterday didn't go so well. The crowd shifted. People who didn't know Blake sensed the change in temperature. People who did know him stepped back, creating space the way you create space around something dangerous. Blake pulled off his sunglasses, smiled, the kind of smile that's really a weapon. 20,000, Earl, cash, right now. Save yourself and the kid the embarrassment of round 2. Not for sale. 25. Not for sale, Blake. Blake's smile thinned. He turned to look at Caleb, really looked at him, for the first time, took in the duct-tape sneakers, the too big flannel, the grease-streaked face, the toolbox with the worn leather and the brass clasps. This is your mechanic? He said it the way you'd say the punchline to a joke that isn't funny. Earl, I'm trying to do you a favor. That bike is a museum piece. It belongs in climate-controlled storage. Not in this, he gestured at the garage. Not in a place like this, being manhandled by a child who should be in school. Caleb stepped forward. The crowd went silent in a new way. Electric, expectant. An 8-year-old boy looking up at a man in a $2,000 jacket. It belongs on the road. Blake looked down at him. Son, I own 15 vintage bikes, professionally restored, temperature controlled, every one of them worth more than this building. I think I know what belongs where. Then why don't you ride any of them? The question hit Blake like a door swinging open in the dark. His smile faltered. Just a flicker, there and gone, but Caleb saw it, and so did everyone else. Excuse me? You collect them, you display them, but you don't ride them. So what are they for? Blake's eyes narrowed. They're investments. No, sir, they're prisoners. Caleb's voice didn't waver. You take machines that were built to run free, and you lock them in a room so nobody can touch them. That's not collecting, that's a cage. The silence that followed was so absolute you could hear the fluorescent lights buzzing 3 rooms away. Blake Morrison stared at the boy. His jaw worked. Something moved behind his eyes. Fast, complicated, human, before the mask came back down. 25,000, he said again, but his voice had changed. Harder, colder. Final offer. Roach spoke. His arms stretched full length to reach the grips, fingers wrapping around rubber that had been shaped by Hawk Brewer's hands over thousands of miles. His feet hung above the pegs, too short to reach them. He looked ridiculous. He looked impossible. He looked like exactly what he was, a child on a machine built for a man, in a room full of adults who had failed where he was about to try. The clock read 11:47, 13 minutes. Caleb placed both hands on the grips, felt the weight of the bike beneath him. 40 years of stillness, 40 years of waiting. Every mile Hawk Brewer had ever ridden, stored in the metal, sleeping in the steel. He looked at the key, his hand reached for it, and stopped. He closed his eyes, breathed in, breathed out, not stalling, centering. The way his grandfather used to stand at his workbench before starting a job, hands flat on the surface, breathing once, deep and slow, before picking up the first tool. Caleb opened his eyes. His hand found the key. He turned it. Click. The same sound from yesterday. The same mechanical snap from deep inside the engine. The same sound that had preceded failure, humiliation, tears. 250 people flinched. Blake Morrison's lips twitched toward a smile. Wade closed his eyes. Caleb didn't react. His hand stayed on the key. Steady. Still. He turned it again. The engine coughed. A sound like something waking from a dream. Deep, confused, grasping for consciousness. Metal moved against metal. Pistons that had been frozen for 40 years shifted in their cylinders for the first time, protesting, fighting, remembering. The cough came again, deeper, stronger, a growl now, low and raw and alive in a way the cough yesterday hadn't been. Something was different, something fundamental had changed. The crowd leaned forward, every body, every breath, every heartbeat synchronized into a single pulse of need. Please, please, please. Caleb turned the key a third time. The engine caught. Not a cough, not a sputter, a catch, the unmistakable sound of combustion finding its rhythm, of fuel meeting spark, meeting air, in the exact ratio that God or physics, or whatever you believe in, designed it to. The engine turned over once, twice, found itself, steadied, and then it roared. The sound that came out of that bike was not mechanical. It was something from the earth itself. A roar that started low in the belly of the engine and climbed, climbing and climbing, filling the garage from floor to ceiling, shaking the walls, rattling the tools on the workbench, vibrating through the concrete floor and up through the legs of every person standing on it until they felt it in their teeth, in their bones, in the place behind their ribs where the soul lives. The exhaust blew 40 years of carbon and dust out in a black cloud that smelled like time unlocking. The engine settled into a rhythm, rough at first, uneven, an old man clearing his throat after a long silence. Then smoother, then steadier, then strong. Caleb twisted the throttle. Just slightly. The engine answered, roaring louder, higher, a sound that drowned out everything. Thoughts, doubts, every word every person in that room had ever said about what was and wasn't possible. Nobody moved, nobody breathed. Then the sound hit them, not the engine sound, but what the engine sound meant. And 250 people erupted at the same time. The noise was volcanic, cheering and screaming and clapping and stomping, an explosion of joy and disbelief and something deeper, something that came from the part of the human heart that never stops hoping, even when the mind says stop. Men who hadn't cried since their fathers died stood with tears pouring down their faces and didn't wipe them away. Women grabbed strangers and hugged them. The reporter dropped her microphone. The cameraman forgot to film. Porter Hayes, who'd taken bets against this boy for 4 straight days, stood frozen with his mouth open and his wallet still in his hand. And then he started clapping, slow at first, then faster, then pounding his hands together so hard they turned red. Wade Prescott stumbled backward. His hand covered his mouth. His eyes were wide and wet, and he was shaking his head back and forth, over and over, because his mind could not accept what his ears were telling him. 22 years of experience, 22 years of knowing what was possible and what wasn't. And an 8-year-old boy had just obliterated every assumption he'd ever made. Diane grabbed Wade's arm. She was crying, openly, freely, the way she hadn't cried in years. "He did it," she said. "Wade, he did it. A millimeter. It was a millimeter." Wade couldn't speak, just shook his head, kept shaking it. Roach stepped away from the wall. The other 2 angels moved with him. 3 men who'd carried a dead brother's promise across 6 years and 1,000 miles walked toward the bike with faces that held everything: grief and gratitude and brotherhood, and the kind of respect that isn't given but earned. Roach stopped in front of Caleb. The boy sat on the rumbling bike, hands on the grips, vibration running through his whole small body. The engine pulsed beneath him like a second heartbeat. Roach looked at him, really looked at him. Then he did something no one in that garage expected. He knelt, one knee on the concrete, eye level with the boy. A Hell's Angel, road-scarred, battle-worn, built from decades of wind and violence and loyalty, kneeling before an 8-year-old child. "Hawk would have loved you," Roach said. His voice broke on the name. "He would have loved every single thing about you." He reached into his cut, pulled out something wrapped in cloth, unfolded it. A riding glove, black leather, cracked and worn, too big for Caleb's hand by a mile. But it had been Hawk Brewer's, had gripped these same handlebars through 18 states and a lifetime of road. "He'd want you to have this," Roach said. Caleb took it. His hand was trembling. He slid his small fingers into the glove. It swallowed his hand, the leather soft and warm and shaped by a dead man's grip, and he held on to the handlebar with it. The leather creaked, the sound of something that had lived, living again. Roach stood, stepped back. The other 2 angels did the same. Earl pushed through the crowd, had to shout over the engine just to be heard. "You did it! Caleb, you did it!" Caleb looked at him, and the grin that split his face was so wide and so pure and so full of something that had been missing from his eyes for 4 years that Earl had to look away for a second. Had to. Because the joy on that boy's face was too much to take in all at once. "She just needed someone to listen," Caleb shouted back. "She just needed someone to believe." Earl looked at the open garage door, sunlight pouring through, Highway 61 stretching beyond, straight and long and free. "She needs to feel the road," Earl said. He climbed onto the bike behind Caleb, or rather he climbed on and pulled Caleb forward, positioning the boy between his arms, hands over Caleb's hands on the grips. The boy's back against the old man's chest, the engine rumbling beneath them both. "Hold on," Earl said. "I'm not letting go," Caleb said. Earl eased the clutch. The bike rolled forward. The crowd split apart, creating a corridor to the door, to the daylight, to the road. Hands reached out as they passed, touching the bike, touching Caleb's shoulder, touching anything they could reach, like the machine was carrying something holy and they wanted to be part of it. The tires hit asphalt. The engine sang. Earl shifted into second. Third, the bike surged forward, steady and strong and alive. And the wind hit Caleb's face and filled the oversized glove and pushed his hair back. And for the first time in his life, the boy understood what Hawk Brewer had known all along. Freedom isn't a place, it's a feeling. And it lives in the space between a machine that runs and a road that never ends. Behind them, 250 people spilled out of the garage and into the parking lot and onto the shoulder of Highway 61, watching a 64-year-old mechanic and an 8-year-old boy ride a dead man's motorcycle into the morning light. And somewhere in the crowd, standing beside his Cadillac Escalade, with his sunglasses in his hand and his mask finally down, Blake Morrison watched them go. His lips parted, his eyes glistened, his hands hung at his sides empty, and for the first time in years, he felt how empty they really were. The sound of the engine faded down the highway, grew smaller, became a hum, then a whisper, then silence. Blake stood there for a long time after everyone else had gone back inside, staring down the empty road. Then, so quietly that not even the man standing next to him heard it, he said, "I had a bike once, sold it when I stopped believing in things." He put his sunglasses on, got in his Escalade, drove away. He never made another offer on the bike, never showed up at another auction. 6 months later, every bike in his collection went up for sale. All 15 sold to riders who promised, in writing, to ride them. Every single one. People said Blake Morrison had some kind of breakdown. Some said revelation. He never talked about it publicly, but everyone who'd been in that garage knew what had changed him. The same thing that changed all of them. Watching something come back to life reminds you what you've let die in yourself. Earl and Caleb rode for an hour, every back road in the county, through stretches of highway that Hawk Brewer himself had probably ridden decades before. Wade and Diane followed in Earl's truck, just in case, just to be there if something went wrong. Nothing went wrong. The bike never faltered, never stuttered, never gave a single hint that it had spent 40 years in silence. It ran the way it was built to, strong, steady, alive. Every gear shift smooth, every acceleration clean. The engine that 5 mechanics had declared dead hummed with a consistency that would have made any factory proud. Caleb sat between Earl's arms with the wind in his face and Hawk Brewer's glove on his hand, and his grandfather's words alive in his chest, and he laughed. Out loud, into the wind, the sound of a boy who had finally proven, not to his father, not to the crowd, not to anyone but himself, that abandoned doesn't mean worthless, that broken doesn't mean done, that sometimes all it takes is someone who listens. They rolled back into the garage at noon. The engine ticked as it cooled, a steady, rhythmic pulse, like a heart settling after a long run. Caleb sat on the bike between Earl's arms, hands still gripping the handlebars, Hawk's glove still swallowing his small fist, and he didn't want to let go. Not yet. Not ever. The crowd was still there, every single one of them, waiting in the parking lot, on the sidewalk, along the shoulder of the highway. When the bike appeared around the bend, the cheering started before Earl even pulled into the lot. People rushing forward, hands reaching, voices calling Caleb's name like he was someone they'd known their whole lives. Earl killed the engine. The silence that followed felt sacred. Caleb climbed off. His legs were shaking, not from fear, from vibration. An hour on a shovel head will rattle your bones loose, and his bones were 8 years old and half the size of the man the bike was built for. He stood on the concrete and his knees buckled. Earl caught him, steadied him, didn't let go until the boy nodded. "How'd she run?" Earl asked. Caleb looked up at him, eyes bright, face streaked with road dust and dried tears, in a joy so raw it hurt to look at. Like she never stopped. Diane was the first to reach them. She didn't say anything clever, didn't offer professional analysis. She crouched down, took Caleb's face in both hands, and looked him in the eyes. "You just changed how I do my job," she said. 30 years I've been working on engines. 30 years I've been following manuals and running diagnostics and trusting instruments over instinct. And you put your ear on the block and listened." Her voice cracked. "I'm never going to forget that, not as long as I live." She kissed his forehead, stood up, walked away fast, wiping her eyes with the heel of her hand. Wade came next. He stood in front of Caleb for a long moment without speaking. His jaw was tight. His eyes were red. He looked like a man trying to find words big enough to carry what he was feeling and failing. He extended his hand. Caleb took it. Wade's palm swallowed the boy's fingers entirely, but the grip was equal, firm, steady, respect meeting respect. "I was wrong about you," Wade said. His voice was rough. "I've been doing this 22 years and I thought I knew everything there was to know. I looked at that bike and I saw death because that's what my experience told me to see. You looked at it and saw life because that's what your heart told you to find." He tightened his grip. "Experience isn't the same as wisdom. I learned that from you. I won't forget it." Caleb held the handshake. "You weren't wrong about the fuel line, Mr. Prescott, or the wiring, or the plugs. All of that was real. You just stopped one step too early." Wade's face broke, not in sadness, in something worse, in the recognition that a child had just described the central failure of his career in a single sentence. He'd always stopped one step too early, had always trusted the checklist over the instinct, had always let experience tell him when to quit instead of asking the machine if it was ready. "One step," Wade repeated. His voice was barely a whisper. "That's all it was." Wade nodded, released Caleb's hand, turned and walked to his truck, sat in the driver's seat for 20 minutes with his hands on the wheel, staring at nothing, recalibrating everything he thought he knew. The crowd began to thin. People left the way they'd come, in trucks and on motorcycles, carrying a story they'd tell for the rest of their lives. The reporter got her interview. The cameraman got his footage. By late afternoon, the parking lot was nearly empty. But the story wasn't over. Not yet. Because there was a piece that nobody except Earl knew. A piece that explained why he'd let an 8-year-old boy walk into his garage and touch a bike that meant more than money or reputation or professional pride. A piece that connected everything: Caleb, the bike, the angels, and a debt that was 35 years old. Earl waited until the garage was quiet, just him and Caleb and the bike and the late afternoon light. He pulled 2 stools to the workbench, sat on one, pointed to the other. "Sit down. I need to tell you something." Caleb sat. His legs swung above the floor, too short to reach. Earl was quiet for a while, working through something, finding the starting point of a story he'd never told anyone. "In 1990, he said, I was 30 years old, riding solo cross-country. My bike broke down on a highway outside El Paso. Middle of July, 112 degrees, 50 miles from the nearest town. No cell phone, no way to call for help." Caleb listened, didn't interrupt. "I sat on the side of that road for 2 hours. Dozens of cars passed me. Trucks, families. Nobody stopped. Not one person. I was running out of water, starting to get dizzy from the heat, starting to think I might actually die on that road." Earl's hands were flat on the workbench. He stared at them. Then a motorcycle pulled over. A Hell's Angel, big man, brown hair going gray, scar on his chin, rode a custom shovel head, black tank, silver flames. Caleb's eyes went wide. His gaze shot to the bike standing 10 feet away. Black tank, silver flames. "He didn't ask my name," Earl said. "Didn't ask where I was headed or why I was alone or whether I could pay him. He just walked over with his toolbox, knelt beside my bike, and went to work. Spent 5 hours in that heat. Wouldn't take water when I offered. Wouldn't take breaks. fabricated a repair from parts he carried in his saddlebags, things that shouldn't have fit, shouldn't have worked, but he made them work, the way you make things work. Earl's voice thickened. He swallowed hard. When my bike started, I tried to pay him. He refused. Tried to thank him. He waved me off. He got back on his bike, that bike right there, and he looked at me, and he said, "That's what we do. We keep each other running." Caleb's eyes were filling. His name was Daniel Brewer. Everyone called him Hawk, and he was the man who built the machine you just brought back to life. The garage was silent. Caleb stared at Earl. Earl stared at his hands. "I never saw him again," Earl said. "Never got to repay the debt. Never got to tell him that those 5 hours in the desert changed how I saw the world, changed how I treated people, changed everything." He looked at Caleb. When those 3 angels rolled up with his bike, I knew. I knew this was my chance. Not to repay Hawk, you can't repay the dead, but to honor him, to keep the cycle going, to make sure that the kind of man Hawk was didn't disappear from the world. He reached over, put his hand on Caleb's shoulder. "And when I looked at you, when you walked into this garage with that toolbox and put your hand on that frame, I didn't see an 8-year-old boy with more hope than sense. I saw Hawk. I saw the kind of person who doesn't walk past broken things, who doesn't decide something is worthless just because everyone else has, who believes that what's been abandoned still deserves a chance." Caleb's tears spilled. He didn't wipe them. "That's why I gave you the keys," Earl said. "Not because I thought you could fix the bike, because I knew you were the only one who'd try the way it needed to be tried. With your hands and your heart and your ear pressed against the metal, listening for what no one else could hear." Caleb leaned forward and pressed his forehead against Earl's arm. Earl put his hand on the back of the boy's head. They stayed like that for a long time. "He saved you," Caleb whispered. "He saved me." "And you saved me." Earl's throat closed. His hand tightened on Caleb's head. "No, son, you saved yourself. I just gave you the keys." A week later, Earl found Caleb on the garage steps at dusk, watching the sun go down. He lowered himself onto the step beside the boy. His knees cracked, his back protested, but he sat. They were quiet together, comfortable, the kind of quiet that lives between people who don't need to fill silence with sound. "You know what you're going to do now?" Earl asked. Caleb thought about it. "Keep fixing things people give up on." "Good, but you're doing it here. Every day after school. Weekends. Summers. I'm not asking, I'm telling." Caleb looked at him. "Serious? This garage needs someone who sees what I used to see. Someone who still believes machines deserve respect, not just repair." Earl paused. "Someone who reminds me why I started doing this in the first place." "I don't know everything, Mr. Dawson. Nobody does. That's not the point. The point is, you know how to listen. Everything else, I'll teach you." Caleb smiled. "When do I start?" "You already did, 5 days ago." They shook on it. An old man's hand in a boy's hand. A partnership built on grease and grief and the shared belief that broken things still matter. Caleb's mother came to the garage the following Saturday, stood in the doorway watching her son work, small hands steady on a wrench, face serious with concentration, surrounded by tools and parts, and a 64-year-old man who spoke to him like an equal. Earl walked over. "Your boy's got something I haven't seen in 40 years of doing this." Ruth's eyes were wet. His father never saw it. Earl looked at her, then at Caleb, then back at her. His father wasn't looking. Ruth pressed her hand over her mouth, nodded, couldn't speak, watched her son work for another 10 minutes. Then she went home and took down the last photograph of Caleb's father that still hung on the hallway wall. Put it in a box. Put the box in the closet. Caleb never asked about it. He didn't need to. Some doors, once closed, don't need to be opened again. The bike still runs today. Earl rides it every Sunday down Highway 61, with Caleb on the back, arms wrapped around the old man's waist, the engine steady and strong beneath them both. They take the long stretches where the road cuts through cotton fields, and the horizon opens up so wide it feels like the edge of the world. On the anniversary of Hawk Brewer's death, they ride it to the cemetery, park beside the headstone, sit in silence for a minute, one old mechanic and one small boy, side by side, saying nothing because nothing needs to be said. Then Earl starts the engine. Caleb's hand finds the throttle. Together, they twist it wide open and hold it for 60 seconds. Full roar. The sound rolls across the graveyard, over the headstones, across the fields, and carries into the sky. 60 seconds that say everything. I'm still here. Still running. Still free. And I remember you. Then silence. Then the ride home. Then another week of fixing things the world threw away. And another. And another. If you've ever been told you're too young, too old, too broken, too quiet, too different, if anyone has ever looked at you and decided you weren't worth the trouble, this story is yours. Not because it has a happy ending, because it has a true one. Nothing is beyond saving if someone believes enough to try. Not bikes, not people, not dreams that everyone else has given up on. Maybe you're the Caleb in someone else's story, the one who refuses to walk away, the one who listens when everyone else has stopped. Or maybe you're the bike, sitting still, waiting, hoping someone will come along and hear what you've been trying to say. Either way, you're not done yet. You're not broken. You're not worthless. You're just waiting for someone who listens. Keep running.